Thank you. um, good evening, everyone. I want to thank NCAER, Shekhar, for inviting me to give this lecture. I think it's fair to say that, the India Policy Forum is kind of one of the big events in the summer calendar of New Delhi. Winter calendar has many occasions like this, but few to match, so it's good that you're spacing it around over the years. So I'm delighted to be here. I think it's produced over the course of the last 12, 13 years a lot of good research on policy in India, which I've been an avid consumer of. So I'm really honored to be here. I think that I'm also very excited to be here because this is a topic that I think does get my juices going to some extent, because I've kind of worked a bit on this in the past, and I've also written a book. My book, Eclipse, deals with some of these issues. So I want to share some new thinking on this subject. I want to break my presentation into three parts. First, what sense do we make of all this that's happening around the world? I don't need to tell you what's happening, Brexit, the US elections, the refugee crisis, lots of stuff happening all over the world, Brazil, China, Russia, India. So a lot is going on, and how do you try and understand this is going to be occupy the first part of my presentation. The second part is going to be what the implications are for globalization going forward. And then I want to circle back at the end and talk about the implications of not just Brexit, but the broader context for India. I think sort of one way of thinking about this is to ask the question, even as we speak, we're celebrating or at least marking the 25th anniversary of the famous 1991 reforms, and the Indian Express has been carrying a series of really fine pieces on this, So I think the question is, if and how should India prevent the backlash, the possible backlash against globalization, which could in some ways, derail India's own, long-term growth prospects. I'm going to be using the word convergence quite a bit. By that I mean, how do countries like India, poorer countries like India, generate 8-10% growth and catch up with the economic frontier, as it were. So I think it's really quite an opportune moment to ask some of these questions. Now, let me begin with a bit of historical perspective. This is a kind of paper that I wrote a few years ago. I mean, whenever we talk about globalization, I think it's worth getting a historical perspective on this. And I think broadly one could, characterize the last, 120, 150 years as having, 4 phases of globalization. I think the first phase is what's, it's between 1870 and 1914. At least in the modern era, we call this, the first great era of globalization, or the first globalization, as it were. And then, of course, we had, the nasty interwar years, where we had, a rapid reversal, which led to massive deglobalization of the world economy. Now, whenever we speak about this period and about globalization, I mean, you cannot but go back to that, fantastic, famous passage by John Maynard Keynes in The Economic Consequences of the Peace, which is really a paean to globalization. It begins by saying, what an extraordinary episode in the economic progress of man that age was, which came to an end in August 1914. And then he goes on to say how the inhabitant of London, he can sit in his bedroom, he can drink tea from anywhere in the world, he can invest anywhere in the world, he can travel anywhere in the world. So I think, that was really the first era of globalization. And then he also has a lovely phrase to characterize this. He says, the projects and politics of militarism and imperialism, of racial and cultural rivalries, played serpent to this paradise. So these are the first, 2 eras of globalization. And then, of course, we had, after the war, what would we call the era of re-globalization, a combination of declining, improving technology, declining transport costs, and combined with very aggressive trade liberalization by certainly the advanced countries, this is, I forgot to tell you, I'm plotting here the export to GDP ratio. See, it was about 15, 16% at the end of the first year of globalization. Trade to GDP picks up. And then we enter, say, somewhere after 1990, what I call, the era of hyper-globalization, when trade to GDP picks up, enormously. So in a sense, the open question confronting us, or the question that all of us should think about, is going forward, which of these three trajectories awaits us going forward? More hyper-globalization, the status quo, or, the projects and politics of nativism and isolationism taking us into a reversal, much like the interwar years. So I think in some ways this is a good historical perspective on this. It's interesting that, and Devesh reminded me that while we talk about, the trade reversal in the interwar years, actually in 1917, the United States actually enacted some draconian measures to limit immigration. And essentially what the Immigration Act of 1917 said was, idiots, and I'm quoting, idiots, imbeciles, epileptics, alcoholics, criminals, and Asians are not basically allowed to enter the United States, because the act was in fact called the Asiatic Barred Zone Act. So the reversal here was not just trade in goods, but also the movement of people, because after all, from about 1850 onwards, the US had witnessed massive immigration on a scale almost unprecedented in the history of humanity. So this is, I think, a good historical perspective to keep in mind. I think the other important perspective to keep in mind, which kind of explains some of the ironies that are kind of laden in what's going on. You see, in fact, this era of hyper-globalization coincides with something that's very interesting, what I call, the reversal of fortunes between the rest and the West. After 1950 until about 1990, and here I'm plotting per capita GDP growth, and the red line is average per capita GDP growth in the advanced countries. So it was really a great period for the US, France, Germany, Japan, UK, where rates of economic growth were really very, very rapid. And then you see the reversal. Am I getting, yeah, so sorry. Essentially that here, in this period, advanced countries grow more rapidly. I don't know why this is not showing this. There's something wrong with the chart. But essentially that after 1990, the poorer countries grow much more rapidly than the advanced countries. So in some sense, it is not a coincidence that whereas in this period when the West was growing rapidly, you didn't hear these kind of calls against globalization. But in fact, when the fortunes have been reversed, ironically now, the backlash against globalization has been much more loud, insistent, and strident in the weakening West than in the rising West, which is a kind of thought I will come back to later on. So there's both a kind of positive point and a normative point inherent in this. I mean, the positive point is what I just said, that the understanding where the backlash is coming from. But I think the normative point also is that given that this era of hyper-globalization coincides it's not coincidentally with the rise of the rest. I mean, isn't it in the interest of the rest to ensure that some form of globalization, hyper-globalization, is maintained going forward, so that this process of catch-up and convergence, especially for a country like India, is maintained going forward? So that's kind of the normative question I think that we have to keep in mind when we think about this. So let's get into it and say, where are we headed? And to be honest with you, I have vacillated on this quite a bit. When I wrote the book Eclipse, and when I used to go around presenting the book, I would put up this question and say, what I would say then, what do? Because it's around 2010, 2011 when the book came out. What did Michael Spence, Joe Stiglitz, Larry Summers, Paul Krugman, Paul Samuelson, and Alan Blinder have in common? I mean, these are all Nobel Prize winners. These are all, all the greatest prizes in economics. And they're all, impeccably liberal and cosmopolitan in their credentials. Yet, even by 2010, all of these people were expressing misgivings about globalization. So in some sense, this was the canary in the coal mine. And in fact, Pratap Mehta, Devesh Kapoor and I wrote a piece in the Financial Times in response to Paul Samuelson kind of Larry Summers, public intellectual in chief, tacking to the left on globalization. And we kind of said, just as when our turn is arriving, you want to close off your markets and foreclose the growth prospects for countries like us. So in some sense, the writing was on the wall, at least 5-7 years back. But then, to be completely honest, and I must confess, 2 to 3 years later, about a few years ago, what did strike me was that if you look at the United States, it suffered or was hit by what I call the greatest trade shock, import shock in history. I mean, if you look at how much imports from China came into the United States, and if you calibrate for the fact that those were imports coming from a much poorer country, which creates all kinds of complications at the receiving end. This was a major shock to China, and yet there was no serious protectionist response on the part of the United States. So in a sense, I kind of vacillated between recognizing that there was a canary in the coal mine, and yet also seeing the evidence that despite all this going on, there hadn't been this protectionist response on the part of the US. Of course, I was too early, and within a few years, we see US politics, not just, both candidates have tacked significantly in favor of, being somewhat lukewarm about globalization. So in a sense, this is my own vacillation. And so now I'm trying to understand what exactly is happening, when we think about this. I think one must distinguish what's going on in the United States with what's going on in the European Union. In the United States, I think there's a much broader disenchantment with the economy and not just with globalization. I think, it's really a quadruple whammy that's hit the United States. There's slowing productivity growth, and it's been evident for about, 15, 20 years, which Robert Gordon has written about. And of course, the associated technology challenge where, machines are replacing humans. Then there's the kind of what's happening at the top of the income spectrum. Let's call this the Piketty phenomenon, where productivity growth is very slow, but what there is disproportionately taken up by the top 1%. And Piketty, of course, has written eloquently on this. Then I think there is what I called in the book the beleaguered middle class problem, which is basically median wages had been stagnant. Interestingly, not for the last 10 years, but since basically the second oil shock. Since 1980, median wages in the United States have stagnated. And of course, the last thing is declining mobility. So all of this is captured in a lovely, something that Larry Katz, who's a labor professor at Harvard, he said, think of the American economy as a large apartment block. A century ago, even 30 years ago, it was the object of envy. But in the last generation, its character changed. The penthouses at the top kept getting larger and larger. The apartments in the middle are feeling more and more squeezed, and the basement has flooded. To round it off, the elevator is no longer working. That broken elevator is what gets people down the most. I think it's this combination of things that's happening, which I think is what we're seeing now. In the European Union, something more is happening. I think because immigration has become a big issue, I think there's much more than economics going on. There's the whole identity question: who am I? Who's a Brit? Who's a Scotsman? Who's a European? All those issues, and they're becoming salient. And of course, the European project, as it were, is kind of increasingly coming into question. And I think the best, description of this is by Ambrose Evans Pritchard, who's a UK commentator, an academic, and I think he was actually a very reluctant leaver, as it were. He didn't buy into any of the, he didn't discount at all the fact that the economic costs of Brexit would be high. But he wrote, and I quote here, "The project bleeds," that is the European project, "bleeds the lifeblood of the national institutions, but fails to replace them with anything lovable or legitimate at the European level. It draws away charisma and destroys it. This is how democracies die. And of course, going back 20, 25 years, the irony, of course, is that the British politician who actually embraced Europe with a vengeance was actually Margaret Thatcher in signing the Single European Act, which created the common market. And of course, she said quite famously, and I still remember this because we used to live there, she said, "We have not rolled back the state in Britain only to see it being reimposed from Brussels." So this sense that, we want to reclaim our sense of empowerment is, I think, something quite strong going on in the European Union. And of course, there's also the whole, indictment of elites and experts. I think Davos man better be much more, should walk with much less of a swagger, I think, these days, because he is under attack seriously. But I think it would be dishonest to say that we understand entirely what's going on, because there is a deep puzzle going on here, which is that if you think about what's happening, this whole globalization problem, the obvious necessary solution of this is clearly a stronger, bigger state that cushions people against some of the adversity and dislocation that comes from globalization, and also provides the wherewithal to make them more mobile so that their prospects can improve. But that obvious necessary solution is not resonating, certainly not in the United States, and maybe not even in Europe. I think when Ronald Reagan said government is the problem, not the solution, I think the United States still hasn't shrugged that off at all. So in some ways, if you think about it, Obamacare, the kind of welfare state being expanded, still under assault and could unravel, if you have, a president in the Supreme Court of a certain intellectual persuasion, it could easily unravel. Similarly, the UK, in response to Brexit, they proposed tax cuts. And very interestingly, in the UK, the people who benefited most from the Brussels dole out were more likely to vote to leave than others. So something strange is going on which you don't fully understand. So I think there's both interesting things going on, but also the responses I think we still are trying to sort our way through. Now, I think all of this, all of you know quite well, but I want to kind of try and parse out a little bit more what are the distinctive features of this disenchantment with globalization. Let me offer 4 or 5 thoughts here. Yeah, I think one should kind of analytically make a distinction between what I would call disembodied versus embodied globalization. Immigration has become much more salient because it's embodied, the guy comes from somewhere and lives next to you, and it creates a whole set of issues beyond economics, which I think are pretty challenging. But the flow of ideas and technologies, and I would say even capital to some extent, I think are not facing the challenge that trade and labor flows are facing. So I think this is, what is the corollary of that? The fact that immigration has become more important means, it has given rise to more right-wing, the strength of the right-wing parties is to some extent related to issues of, identity and so on. And Danny Roderick makes a very good point recently that he says that if you look at Europe, in all those countries where immigration has become a big issue, you've seen the rise of the extreme right. Whereas in Greece and Spain, which didn't have to contend with this, it's been associated with the rise of the left, because there the issue has been austerity rather than immigration. And of course, the phenomenon that we see now, both in Europe and in the United States, of course, is that there is a kind of strange kind of coming together of the far right and the far left for completely different reasons, but both united in their stand against globalization, which I think is something the old left-right distinctions are becoming much more fluid and breaking down much more than they ever were. So that's one, I think, distinctive aspect of globalization. I think the second aspect of globalization, which I find quite distinctive, is the difference between the United States experience and the experience in Europe. I think in the United States, we are seeing more integration between dissimilars, i.e., what I call, rich and poor. If you look at trade with Mexico, trade with China, it's kind of developing country integration. And you find relatively shallow forms of integration. I mean, in Mexico, it's true that Mexican immigrants have come in, but largely it's about, trade. It's less about, deeper forms of integration like currency and monetary unions and so on. Now, in the European Union, of course, it's actually quite interestingly different. The integration is much deeper. Remember, the Single European Act requires all countries to adopt the 4 freedoms: goods, services, capital, and labor. And that's what the UK is now struggling with. And of course, monetary union. So in the European Union, unlike the United States, you're getting much deeper integration, and interestingly, but that integration is between similars. I don't want to get into trouble here, but think of it this way, that in UK, the problem of immigration is not the worker from, at least at this stage, India and Pakistan and Bangladesh, but it is the Polish plumber, the Croatian waitress, someone much more similar in kind of identity. So the European and the American experiences are quite different, and yet both are under siege. So in some ways, the shallow integration amongst unequals and the deeper integration among similars are both under attack in these places. And that's what I think is in some ways both disheartening and noteworthy as well. I want to say that developing countries mostly undertake shallow integration, but there the anxieties are much more about trade and capital flows, and this is especially true of Latin America. The other observation I would make, which I've made already, is that it's this ironic inversion that's happened. In the 80s and even 90s, the anxieties about globalization and around the discussions around the Washington Consensus were, emanated from the South. It's developing countries who are anxious about globalization, but now you see a kind of reversal where the strongest backlash is happening in the advanced countries. And as I showed earlier, perhaps it's not ironic at all, because in that period, it seems to mirror the changing fortunes of the West and the rest, as hyper-globalization has coincided with the rising West and the weakening West. I think the debate around globalization has become quite interestingly different and nuanced. Now, what are the implications? I mean, I think that in some ways what's going to be critical going forward in terms of possible domino effects and the fate of globalization is going to be the eurozone. And I want to share some thoughts on the eurozone itself. I mean, there is no question that, in the post-war period, the most lofty political project, in terms of burying hundreds of years of animosity and atavistic hatred, was the European project. And it also became the most ambitious economic project. First, a lot of trade integration and so on, then the Single European Act, and then, of course, culminating in monetary union. The question is, can it succeed? And I'm not going to say yes or no, but let me tell you what the 3 challenges are that confront the Eurozone. I think the whole Eurozone thing can very much be examined from the point of view of what political scientists or actually international relations experts talk about hegemonic stability. Is a kind of regime of hegemony stable or not? And I think that does apply to the European Union in some very interesting ways. I think it faces 3 challenges. The first one is, post-German unification and now post-Brexit, I think Germany's role has become unusually large. This is something I was told. Apparently, François Mitterrand, the astute, wily politician, when he saw German unification coming, apparently he told himself the European project is probably fatally undermined. I don't know, and this gives you a sense of that. This chart shows Germany's share of EU population, 85 before unification, 2000 after unification, and 2016 post-Brexit. And I've taken this as a share of the 5 biggest countries that wield power in the European Union. It goes from 17% to 31% after unification, And if the UK were to withdraw, I mean, decisively, it would go up to 37%. It would then become a region with a hegemon within Europe, much like the United States has been the global hegemon. So that's fact number one, which I think one has to keep in mind when thinking about the stability of the Eurozone. Fact number two is that, Pratap Mehta wrote the other day that, to use economic instrumentalism as an argument to justify something like the European arrangement, and he said, if you call it a necessary evil, it's very dangerous because people forget the necessary and focus on the evil. But in some ways, I think even that is not true, because the Eurozone's legitimacy, for example, depended on it being a vehicle for convergence. Basically, people signed into the European, at least the poorer countries, because they thought this was the way to become richer and catch up with the advanced countries. But this is the shocking thing. But in the last 20, 30 years, this has become a zone not of convergence, but of what Land Pritchett said in the international context, divergence big time, i.e. gaps in per capita standards of living are not converging, they are diverging. And I want to show you this chart. The black line is German per capita GDP. These are the four periphery countries, Portugal, Italy, Greece, and Spain. Look at the gap here to begin with, and the gap at the end. It's just increased. And countries like India want to grow faster to catch up, which indeed they're doing. But these periphery countries have actually fallen much further behind. So think of this as a region where there is a hegemon, and that has not been the cause of creating convergence within Europe. Now, I don't want to get too technical here because I want to get to India, but I think, Charlie Kindleberger, the economic historian, once said that for there to be hegemonic stability, the hegemon must provide open markets, be able to buy goods from other countries, provide a stable currency, and provide emergency finance. I mean, these are the three basic prerequisites for having hegemonic stability. But I think something quite different has happened within the European Union. I think that Germany today is running the world's largest current account surplus. So instead of being a buyer and a consumer of last resort, it's become an exporter of goods and services, so that other countries which hope to get markets, exactly the opposite has been happening. And even in terms of providing emergency finance, the whole debtor-creditor relationship has, really soured so badly, and there are perceptions, the creditors feel the debtors are not doing enough. The debtors feel we have a really domineering, uncaring hegemon. So whether these are right or wrong, these narratives have come and have taken hold, have become entrenched. So in that sense, the stability of this hegemonic arrangement, with a hegemon that's become very big, in a club that is no longer providing convergence, and the hegemon no longer providing what normal hegemons do, I think, the stability of such an arrangement is, I think, going to be really challenged in the years ahead. So those are my kind of two-penny thoughts on the European Union, because, of course, it has implications for us going forward. So let me tell you what my tentative conclusions are on globalizations. I'm torn between, as always, this has happened before and we will come out, versus, this time is different. Something big has happened which is going to be irreversible. I think that disembodied integration is not under threat, and this is kind of Devesh's insight to me, which I think agree with completely. Ideas, technology, and even foreign capital, I think pretty much are going to go on. But I think deeper forms of integration are in trouble and can be reversed. And my comments on the Eurozone should be seen in that light. But I do think that shallower forms of integration may not be under as much threat as deeper forms. So my one-liner for this, to express this, which I'll come at the end, is that, perhaps, hyper-globalization is dead, long live globalization. So I think that's the sense in which I think, shallower forms can continue. I mean, recall that, why do I say that? Recall that when, globalization was proceeding, the rough kind of number was that 80% was due to technology and 20% due to government policy. Now, even if you took away the government policy because it's going to be less open because of all that we've discussed, there's still that 80% which is going to drive, globalization, declining transport and information costs, and the value-added chains. All that has not gone away. All that's not going to be stopped. So, in that sense, there is a kind of inexorability towards the progress of globalization, which can be impeded, no doubt, by government action, but technology is there as an imperative. The other thing I think is that, what is interesting about the world of the last 20 years is that globalization has no longer become a one-way thing. It's what I call crisscrossing. Interests have become so enmeshed. Just to give one example, China and India get FDI, but they also send out FDI. So if you have situations like that, it's going to be much more difficult to reverse these wholesale, because you create a whole a network of interests that are going to be very, very hard to disentangle and unravel. Maybe I'm speaking too soon. The UK-EU test case is going to be an example of how and how much you kind of unravel what you've already think. So, but one has to watch and wait for that. In some senses, my assertion or my hypothesis that shallower forms of integration will continue, it's going to be tested with the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Let's see what happens. We have a situation in the United States where TPP has been challenged, and let's see what happens when the elections are conducted. Whether, TPP, of course, does have some deeper forms of integration, but I think it's not like a currency union or something like the European Common Market. But I think one shouldn't therefore get over pessimistic and over anxious. I think the anxiety should prevail, apply to deeper forms of integration, and that maybe trade, capital may still survive. So one way of putting it is, of course, that humankind cannot bear too much globalization. So there's a kind of optimum which everybody's going to strive for. And Larry Summers, in a recent piece, he's called for responsible nationalism. I basically think that's a code word for saying, let's not have deep integration. Let's have, shallow, relatively shallow, but not too deep. So it's not a retreat back into autarky and complete nationalism as well. So that, I think, is my assessment of where we're going to head in terms of globalization. And I do think, of course, that along with this, the search for better protection against the impact of globalization, I think, is going to happen across the board. Better social safety nets, maybe wealth taxes on the rich stemming from the work of Piketty, avoiding race to the bottom so that tax bases don't shrink, something that Larry Summers has been calling for, more public investment, and of course, reducing the role of finance. I mean, remember, all of these things is going to come up against that basic problem in the United States of, where the government is still not seen as the solution and still seen as a bit of a problem. So even as we think we know what needs to be done, just as necessary conditions to cushion the impact of globalization, it's not at all obvious that they will happen or it'll be politically easy to make them happen. India. Sorry for keeping you. This is, I hope I've either bored you or whetted your appetite for India. But let me tell you. So I want to break up the implications for India into kind of two: the short run and the medium run. 10 more minutes? Yeah. Are you with me? I hope I'm not boring you. So 10 more minutes. So what are the short-run implications for growth and the responses to the UK and what's happening to the UK and European Union? But I think the even more important questions are the medium-run questions. And let me try and parse them into three. If indeed we're going to see some limits on globalization going forward, i.e. we're not going to have the hyper-globalization, perhaps we won't have the really bad case scenario, and we kind of tread water and trudge along at current levels of globalization, I think the question is three questions. One, should India change its development strategy towards more consumption-led, domestic market-led growth? So that's one question. Second, if not, if you said no, we have to still do outward-oriented growth, will the current external environment, given all that's happened, allow an export promotion strategy? In other words, can the world absorb another China? That's the question. So the first question is about the desirability of an outward orientation strategy. The second question is about the feasibility of an outward orientation strategy. And of course, the last question is, what must India do Two, if it wants to pursue this outward strategy, what must it do to make that happen, both internally and externally? So on the implications in the short run, it's something that we've discussed internally, that I think there is a sense in which the UK, the EU might slow down. I think that will affect our growth prospects going forward. But the flip side of that is that, you know, we'll get some, what we lose on the swings, we gain on the roundabouts. I think oil prices, commodity prices being depressed, you know, what we might lose a little bit on growth, we will certainly get back in terms of macro stability and lower inflation and so on. So moreover, I think India's exports and growth could slow, but they could very easily be offset by the monsoon, lower oil prices, and easier financial conditions internationally. You know, I mean, it's already clear that the Fed probably will delay its rate increase, and there's some probability that it might even lower rates rather than just raise rates going forward. So I think broadly, we are, you know, all the indications from the reactions have been that India has pretty much cushioned what's happened. I think India has emerged from this as a kind of haven of stability and opportunity. So I think in that sense, I think India has weathered this quite well, largely because the fundamentals are strong and the opportunities going forward are bright. Now, in terms of response, I think the Commerce Minister and others have said this as well, that I think we do need to, and we're going to secure and solidify better market access to the UK and EU via proactively thinking about trading arrangements. And in all of this, I think the new thinking that's come into it is that when we think about these trading arrangements, we should focus a lot on of course, the trade consequences, but also on the employment consequences. So just to give you one illustrative example, if you can get better access in clothing, which is very employment intensive, I think that should count for a lot when we assess the costs and benefits of trading arrangements going forward. So that's the short trend. But I think, and these are numbers on India's exposure to the UK and EU. I mean, you've seen these numbers. I think we are exposed to the EU in terms of exports. I think in terms of software services, we are also exposed to the UK to some extent. And of course, India has all these 800 companies which have operations in the UK, which might be affected by what the UK and EU eventually renegotiate in terms of access between each other. So I think there will be some impact, but I think broadly this impact will be relatively muted because of India's you know, pretty good fundamentals. But I think the interesting question is that, you know, consumption-led growth. You know, of course, famously, the governor of the RBI, Nandan Nilekani a few days ago, have all called for, you know, consumption-led growth. You know, this is kind of make for India kind of thing. And I would fundamentally like to push back against this for two reasons. I think consumption-led growth or domestic market-led growth cannot deliver 8 to 10% growth on a sustainable basis. It's theoretically doubtful, and empirically it's just unprecedented. I think theoretically, I think what people seem to miss is that, you know, an outward orientation strategy and an inward oriented strategy is simple, is that in an outward orientation strategy, demand is infinite. You have a productivity shock, you can sell all of that without facing lower prices for that. And that's what an outward orientation strategy gets you. An inward oriented strategy will, what it lead to, you can't sell as much, and if you want to sell more, prices will fall and your welfare will be affected. But beyond the theory is the empirics. I think no East Asian tiger achieved rapid export growth. No East Asian tiger. And rapid is at least 15-20% on average for 20-25 years. Even if you look at India's own experience, when we had the growth boom between 2000 and say 2-3 and 2011-12, it was accompanied by some 24% annual average growth in exports of services and manufacturing. So I think to speak of, you know, double-digit growth and consumption-led growth just don't, I think, gel with each other. Now, the interesting question I would like to ask those who propagate consumption-led growth is, if you say, if I bought into your argument and said consumption-led growth, what does it mean by way of policy? Does it mean import substitution because you want to make selling in the domestic market more attractive? And my response to that is that there's a real asymmetry here. If you have an outward-oriented strategy, you can also sell to the domestic market. But if you're focused only on the domestic market, you cannot sell internationally. So why would you want to do that is a question that I have. And I think the clothing initiative, therefore, which I said, is actually very important in terms of making it a vehicle for exports and job growth. So that's question number one. So I come down decisively in favor of an outward-oriented strategy because both the theory and empirics say that if India aspires, as this government does and should, to 8 to 10% growth, it has to be outward-oriented. The second question is feasible. Is this feasible? Can the world absorb another China? And here I want to show you a statistic here. This is the share of the world, China, and India, the share of exports of goods and services in world GDP. So today, world trade to world GDP is about 27%. China is 3.3%, and India is 0.5%. Now, my calculations are that if the world's political carrying capacity for globalization is fixed because of all that we've seen, i.e., world export to GDP ratios will not grow very rapidly, India can still achieve rapid and sustained export growth of 15% and GDP growth of 8%. India can do that, subject to this overall constraint. But I think it would require some degree of China becoming a normal trader and rebalancing its economy so that, to some extent, this increase is possible. If this is fixed, only if this comes down to some extent. And China, of course, has been overtrading. It is trying to rebalance towards consumption-led growth, and its costs are rising. So in principle, it should be possible for India to merely vacate, to merely occupy the space that is and will be vacated by China going forward. I think the analogy is with climate change here. The early developers occupied the atmosphere and the carbon space, and the late entrants, the late carbonizers, have faced this constraint. So there is a kind of zero-sum game here going on. But I think it can be overcome, but it would require the current occupants to cede some space willingly and so on. I also think that the carrying capacity may be greater for services than for manufacturing. If that is the case, if you go back to this table, the share of exports in world exports, India is still only 0.2%. I think India could very easily raise this substantially to 1.5%, 2% without running up against whatever the costs there are, the political costs in advanced countries of the limits to how much they can absorb goods and services from the outside. I think in services it is possible to do that. So what I come down on is that India cannot be unique in achieving 8% growth without an outward strategy. But India can be unique in achieving this outward strategy via a combination, via a different pattern than followed by all the East Asian economies, i.e. namely not just via manufacturing, but through some combination of manufacturing and services. And that, I think, is going to be India's pathway going forward. Of course, if this carrying capacity for labor mobility, so remember, if deeper forms of integration are going to be subject to barriers, are going to be much more difficult, then of course India would be hurt because I think labor mobility, international labor mobility, has served India so well that I think we would, that I think is a challenge that is going to remain for India. I don't know how we're going to crack that going forward. Now, so last question, how must India position itself? I think that India and other developing countries have a strong incentive in keeping global markets open and preventing a reversal, because our rapid growth, as I've just said, depends upon a market that's open. If you get a reversal because of what goes on, I think even my numbers showed you that there will be less space for India to export and occupy. So I think that requires perhaps assuming leadership on globalization. I think the intellectual debate on globalization is, as I said, has been reversed with we being reticent in the past, advanced countries pushing globalization, and now suddenly they're in retreat. And I think that there is scope for developing countries like India assuming leadership on globalization, subject, of course, to the political constraints that we face internally. I think that will also require engaging less unequally in international trade negotiations. This is a slightly more, controversial proposition that I'm making. I do think that if these constraints and the backlash against globalization are serious in advanced countries, then the notion that they will be willing to offer more market access if other large countries do not do so is going to be increasingly difficult. And therefore, I think that in this new world, it will be increasingly difficult to expect less than full reciprocity by others. So I think that that's something that we should keep in mind when we think about international negotiations going forward. I think we're big. Global markets are very important for our growth going forward. I think that that's the perspective we should bring in terms of our international economic engagement. And as this government has done, I think we should keep FDI flows open. And of course, remember with FDI, the reason I singled this out is, of course, FDI is desirable in its own right. Of course, we have to do everything to revive private domestic investment as well. But the thing about FDI is that you create a stake for people in keeping international markets open. You know, if Apple is going to, in fact, this is what happened between the United States and China. For about 10 years, US labor was against Chinese exchange rate policy. But it's because US firms in China wanted to export back to the United States that they lobbied hard to prevent any trade action and retaliation against China. So that enmeshing of interest that I spoke about earlier will come about through more FDI inflows. And of course, on this, the government has made really rapid strides, and we've become really very, very open to FDI. So I've bored you a lot. So my conclusion, hyper-globalization is dead, long live globalization. The world has moved. Deeper forms of integration, even amongst equals, cannot be sustained, perhaps. But shallower forms may well be. And you see, just the interesting thought, though, that if deeper forms of integration are going to recede, deeper forms have been associated with regionalism and bilateralism. So if shallower forms are going to be the way going forward, this is really an opportunity to revitalize the WTO and multilateralism, because all discussions, or many discussions on shallower forms, will take place in that forum, whereas deeper forms will be much more bilateral and regional. So I think it really is an open. So I've said this before, just to rephrase or paraphrase John Maynard Keynes, we must ensure that the projects and politics of nativism and isolationism do not play serpent to the paradise of open markets and open borders, because as a late and precocious converger, i.e., we still have so much distance to cover, that open market internationally is for us an existential necessity. Thank you very much.